the Victorian era also produced a reaction against this urbanisation, the beginnings of a modern conservation movement. One of the first great battles would be fought by the residents of one of London's most famous and celebrated historic villages. The old hilltop farm village of Hampstead, meaning homestead, was transformed into a fashionable spa resort in the early 18th century after a mineral spring was discovered here. By the mid-19th century, Hampstead was a desirable residential district for affluent Londoners, and the large expanse of common land bordering the village had become a hugely valuable asset. Hampstead's fortunes have always been closely entwined with those of its famous heath. The heath protects the village from London's urban sprawl. But both village and heath only exist as they do today because the residents of Hampstead fought tooth and claw against the lord of the manor, who wanted to develop the heath for housing. The absentee landlord of Hampstead Manor was Sir Thomas Marion Wilson, who first decided he wanted to build on parts of the heath back in the 1820s. This set him on a collision course with the commoners, village residents who leased land from him. Helen Lawrence is the author of a forthcoming book on the fight to save Hampstead Heath.
The commoners were just concerned about their rights. They'd bought quite expensively their leases, as it were, from Marion Wilson, and they were very indignant that he appeared to want to sort of encourage them to build and so on, and that's not what they'd bought these leases for. They'd bought them because it was still a little bit of open country on the edge of the city. If the Hampstead commoners had been greedy, they could easily have sided with Sir Thomas Marion Wilson and got together and agreed to allow Hampstead Heath to be built on. And people, you know, they didn't do that. They thought, no, we've got to keep this. I think one of the things he miscalculated was that most of these battles over enclosures of land were with small farmers. I think he just didn't understand that Hampstead wasn't like that. Hampstead was now full of people, probably some of them as wealthy as he was, and they weren't going to be trampled over.
So Hampstead becomes this battleground, the ancient manorial rights versus the interests of the tenants, of the villagers.
Yeah. The first commoners who opposed him did it purely on their rights and their properties, and they didn't want their properties to be devalued. But because of the Industrial Revolution and the slums developing in towns, you had this new cadre of people rising up who were definitely philanthropists and public-spirited and felt that poor people needed somewhere to be able to go and you must preserve these open spaces. And the whole conversation got widened out in particular from Prince Leopold, who was the youngest son of Queen Victoria, right down to the shopkeepers in Hampstead.
At the end of the day, it comes down to people, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly.
People power, but also people's will to change things. From the 1820s through to the 1860s, Sir Thomas tried to get an act through Parliament giving him rights to develop the heath. But MPs, with the backing of campaigners, the press and Hampstead's commoners, thwarted him time and time again.
He just carried on as if nothing had happened. No, I don't concede that anyone has a right to this land. It's my land, blah, blah. You know, he just did not accept anything.
But he had centuries of sort of manorial history and rights behind him. And he was on the crest of this great sort of social wave that he doesn't seem to be picking up on at all.
He just didn't pick up on it.
And Sir Thomas was swimming against the tide. The Metropolitan Commons Act was passed in 1866, preventing the enclosure of common land within a radius of 15 miles from Charing Cross. Sir Thomas himself died in 1869, and 2 years later, his heir sold the heath to a forerunner of the Greater London Council. A further act was passed guaranteeing that the heath would remain permanently open for public use.
There's scarcely a parliamentary debate or a press report about open spaces throughout that period that doesn't mention Hampstead Heath. It was the sort of the icon of the whole thing. Even though Epping and Wimbledon and all these other places were equally under threat, Hampstead was the thing.
Helen is also a former vice president of the Heath and Hampstead Society, which had its origins in the 19th century struggles to save the Heath.
After the first few decades of the 20th century, they began to realise that with London expanding and so much building going on, they needed to monitor what was being built in order to protect the Heath. They didn't want huge blocks of flats surrounding it. And from then, they got more and more interested in the village itself. The societies had a huge role in saving it and refurbishing it and looking after it and making it accessible to the local residents. It's a very fine record. They've had a programme to renew all the beautiful Edwardian or older lampposts. They've refurbished the original well of the Spa, and Burgh House, just up the road from here, was also saved by the Heath and Hampstead Society people. The other threat that was ongoing from as early as the 1920s was roads. They were always wanting to widen Heath Street, which would have meant literally just knocking it down to make it wider. It culminated in the Bressie Report in the 1930s, which would have knocked down half of Hampstead, and there was supposed to be a flyover which would have come across here somehow and landed in Heath Street. It's a sort of nightmare scenario, and you think to yourself, how on earth could they have even thought of it?
But while the forces of conservation won the day in Hampstead and have continued to preserve the historic fabric of the old village, other parts of the capital were not so fortunate.